and welcome. I'm Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for our program, Accelerated Approvals and the Pathway to Treatments. This afternoon, we will delve into expedited drug approvals and the role they can play in helping patients living with serious or life-threatening conditions. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Alzheimer's Association, for supporting today's conversations. Last year, the Food and Drug Administration approved 14 new drugs, including those for various types of cancer, kidney disease, diabetes, and Crohn's disease via an accelerated approval pathway. The program allows the FDA to approve drugs that treat serious conditions and which fill an unmet need in a shorter time frame than the regular approval process. The FDA's recent approval of an Alzheimer's drug has put the accelerated approval process in the spotlight. Critics are focusing on what they call safety risks, and advocates are focusing on patient access to promising experimental drugs. A few housekeeping notes before we begin the show. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag the Hill ALZ. We are broadcasting live and will be taking your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video. Refreshing the page should, in most cases, fix the problem. My first guest brings both an in-depth knowledge of the topic and regulatory experience to our discussion today. Dr. Mark McClellan is founding director at the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University. He is also a former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration and former administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That's quite a combination. Take a listen to our conversation.
Dr. McClellan, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Bob, good to be with you.
Let me first start off with COVID-19. We're not back to having in-person events really yet. Last summer, a lot of people thought, well, we're going back to normal. We're not there yet. You've been a health leader for decades. Where are we in the battle against COVID-19? And are we going to get back to normal anytime soon?
Yeah, Bob, we're making a lot of progress. We actually had an in-person event last week that went well. Now, it wasn't the old normal. It's the new normal with attention to things like masking when you're in crowded indoor spaces together, air circulation. And the most important thing is we have a whole lot of tools that make COVID now different than it was in the past, not just the effective vaccines, but rapid diagnostic tests, treatments for people who are higher risk, and just a lot of knowledge about how we can prevent and contain spread. Unfortunately, the new Omicron variant's very contagious, very hard to prevent cases altogether, so it is likely to be with us. But I do think it is possible if we take the right steps on using all the tools that we have and making sure people are informed about things they can do to reduce their risk and the risk of people who can get COVID complications who are around them to get towards a new normal.
Let me shift to the FDA's big decision. It was a significant one. You used to head FDA as well as CMS, and those agencies had an interesting role on the whole issue of Aduhelm, Biogen's drug. What did you think of this, how the FDA and then CMS have pivoted on coverage, which is within their jurisdiction? How do you think that process worked, and did it work well?
Well, I think it could work better by thinking and planning ahead of time when we are seeing accelerated approvals or other FDA decisions that may have important issues related to coverage and payment. And this gets back to the fact, Bob, that FDA's approval standards for safety and effectiveness sound a lot like what CMS should be covering, but that coverage is based on a standard called reasonable and necessary. That's reasonable and necessary for the big diversity of Medicare beneficiaries. So what's important for reasonable and necessary? Well, safety and effectiveness certainly are, but CMS is also required to look at not the cost of the treatment, but whether the treatments are appropriate for the diversity of Medicare beneficiaries who live in very diverse circumstances, treated by healthcare systems with different capabilities, et cetera, and have a whole diversity of health risks and benefits themselves. So in the case of Aduhelm, the key points, I think, were number one, this is not just an accelerated approval marker that was used for the decision, but an accelerated approval marker, biomarker that hasn't been used before, and where the evidence, as CMS pointed out in the FDA review process, was a bit less clear and settled than the evidence on many other biomarkers that have been the basis for literally dozens of accelerated approvals in the past. None of those previous accelerated approvals triggered any real concerns on the CMS side for coverage because, as CMS clarified last week, those were well-established biomarkers. And CMS at a event that we had last week went out of their way to say, Lee Fleischer, who heads the coverage division there, to say that this was not a precedent that people should think is going to apply to accelerated approval drugs on a general basis, that for cancer drugs, for others where there is this clear pathway, people should not expect anything to be different. So why was this different? Well, very broad Medicare population with these questions about just how beneficial is the treatment, given what CMS viewed as more limited evidence on the biomarker, and also questions about safety. So there was some evidence of so-called ARIA, these abnormalities that develop in patients who are getting, and swelling that develop in patients who get these new treatments, and questions about what the consequences of those complications could be for the many types of Medicare beneficiaries who were not included, at least in any significant numbers in the trials, those with a lot of comorbid conditions, other chronic diseases, circulatory problems, et cetera. So that's what led to the CMS decision here to say, look, we want more evidence because it was approved under a biomarker that hasn't been as well validated, and because of these questions about the breadth of Medicare beneficiaries who may have different safety profiles and where the risk benefit may have been less clear. Now, people are going to debate that, but I think what people should also pay attention to, just a second important point here, is that the evidence base is going to change a lot in the space of Alzheimer's disease monoclonal antibody drugs over the next year. Bob, there are 3 other drugs that are in pivotal FDA clinical trials now that are expected to have results in the coming weeks and months, not just on the biomarker, but within the next year on actual clinical endpoints that FDA approved, demonstrating benefit in terms of slowing the progression of loss of cognitive function in Alzheimer's disease. And CMS, in its final decision recently, went out of its way to say, we're going to look at that evidence differently based on how strong it is on these drugs. So, not convinced on the biomarker, but looking forward to whether or not these drugs meet their endpoint. And CMS said there, they expect to see broader coverage if the evidence on the actual endpoints is meaningful. And again, that's going to happen within the next year. I would also add to that these drugs are going to provide a lot of new evidence relevant to just how good is this biomarker. So that might make CMS go back and look again at, are we going to get to the point where for Alzheimer's drugs, we can have a biomarker that leads to the same kind of accelerated approval path into coverage as we saw with cancer drugs and drugs for immune conditions and so forth, where again, CMS says, don't expect any new changes or new restrictions to emerge. And then one final point, I know I'm trying to cover a lot here, but this is an important set of issues, is that CMS did say they want more evidence on questions about safety and effectiveness and how the drug can be used in routine clinical practice in this broader, diverse range of Medicare beneficiaries who come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, who very often have some serious comorbid conditions, circulatory issues, others that might lead to potential bigger risks and new and additional management steps needed to use the drugs effectively. And a big question going forward is just how burdensome is that so-called coverage with evidence development going to be? Are Are these, is this a monitoring approach that can be set up in ways that are relatively easy for healthcare providers to participate in? Or is it going to be a lot of burdensome data collection? And that's something where groups like the Alzheimer's Association, other clinical groups that have been involved in registries and tracking patients with Alzheimer's for a long time, hopefully can provide some clarity. How can that evidence be collected in a way that's minimally burdensome and leads to broader access? And wrapped up in that too is just one final issue that I'll mention, which is that because these drugs are relatively new and because the side effect profiles and how to manage them is not something that clinicians have routinely been dealing with, we have a learning curve for clinicians, geriatricians, others in this country who will be needed as Alzheimer's disease continues to evolve with better treatments, both pharmacologic treatments and non-pharmacologic treatments, where new skills are going to be needed. And I think there's more that CMS can do, not just to say, look, we want to make sure that the clinicians who are treating our beneficiaries can manage these side effects and can know what to look for and know how to interpret the scans and so forth, but also things that CMS could do to pay more for good systems of care for people with Alzheimer's. That's one of their major overall goals, is better coordinated and comprehensive care for all Medicare beneficiaries. That includes people with Alzheimer's who right now do not get very well coordinated care. There are these knowledge gaps as the evidence is changing on how Alzheimer's patients should be managed. And I hope that CMS can take some more positive steps there to make it easier for healthcare providers to do what's needed to create a good longitudinal comprehensive care approach for this condition. That is lacking for the vast majority of Alzheimer's patients today, even though we do see good examples around the country of how to do this.
And that leads into my next question about the stakeholder groups and patient groups and providers and industry coming up with a cure to this horrible disease. How do you think that process could, is a role for Congress here to codify some stuff? Well, what do you think, we've seen right to try legislation passed in recent years. So there's some frustration with the government process. Could there be more transparency? Do you think more dialogue? I mean, going forward the next 5-10 years, as we try to find a cure, what is key?
Well, I think I think a lot of people are hoping for rapid progress, and I'm one of them. What we typically see in diseases that are complex and maybe multifactorial, where the mechanisms are maybe not completely understood, but we're getting better and better. We're finding treatments that do seem to make some difference, is that this is an iterative process. So the first HIV drugs or the first cancer drugs are not nearly as good as the second, third, fourth generation. Often it takes more than one treatment or a combination of drugs and other interventions to really get a disease under control. I expect and hope that that's what we're going to start seeing here. And that means, number one, we need to have a clear pathway forward based on the evidence for what happens with coverage, what happens with post-market evidence for these treatments. There's so much to learn, Bob, after drugs are approved, because these are drugs that people are taking with the hope that they're going to have benefits, not next week so much, not next year even, but 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road. If we can intervene early with these diseases, and we're not well set up to do those long-term follow-up studies of patients. That gets back to the point I was making earlier. So what could Congress do to build on efforts that have already been underway to improve systems of real-world evidence, and to give, frankly, CMS more support to help plan for and set up these kinds of systems ahead of time? And do we want to think about maybe new ways of paying for these treatments that are tied to the outcomes they actually achieve over time, and that would really encourage the manufacturers to work with clinicians and patients groups together, not just to get the highest volume of treatment, but to get the treatments most effectively and equitably to the actual patients who would benefit. There are likely to be some big heterogeneities within the population of Alzheimer's patients in terms of how they respond to particular medications and certainly their side effect profiles. So I think there's a lot that Congress could do to help encourage both the financial supports and the real world evidence systems, the longitudinal trial platform systems to take all of those steps. And then finally, one maybe simpler thing is that in this case and others, as Janet Woodcock said last week, this doesn't usually happen. Usually there's a pretty smooth process from FDA approval, including for most drugs that have expedited pathways into coverage and into use. But there are these cases for drugs, for devices sometimes where CMS has set up systems to get more evidence and get more confidence about how the drugs or the treatments can be used in practice. We're not always doing a great job at identifying those issues early. So I think helping CMS and FDA and industry and other stakeholder groups work together where questions about coverage or payment may be on the horizon to be able to anticipate those and maybe engage early in working through, okay, how do we address these challenges so that there isn't a big bump in the road or unexpected things that happen between when a drug is approved and when CMS makes coverage and payment decisions. Those gaps, those bumps don't happen often, but I think some more resources to CMS to work with product developers, other stakeholders, and FDA to anticipate them so that there are no surprises down the road. I think that would be helpful for everybody. And I gotta say, Bob, it's really challenging at CMS now. I had the privilege of leading both FDA and CMS, and in the last 15 years, there have been a lot of additional resources devoted to supporting FDA, enhancing its scientific capabilities, having the resources to meet, probably 1,000 meetings a year with product developers and providing guidance and so forth and clarity about pathways. In contrast, at CMS, the resources available to interact with the key stakeholders about new technologies and the resources that CMS has to bring their expertise to bear and making sure there's clarity about what reasonable and necessary standards mean and how to make sure we're using these treatments as effectively as possible in the Medicare population. Those resources have gone way down so much. It's a very big discrepancy, and just a few additional appropriations on the CMS side, I think, could go a long way towards clarifying and preventing some of these significant bumps in the road that arise rarely but are important, and we want to avoid them, especially with some of the really innovative technologies in the pipeline.
Well, FDA and CMS are going to be certainly busy going forward in both the approval and the payment reimbursement policy in the next several years and going forward. Dr. McClellan, someone who knows a lot about FDA and CMS, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you again.